My parents bought a second house for my sister and expected me to be responsible for the mortgage. I never agreed, didn't sign anything yet. Suddenly found myself tied to a debt I couldn't afford. I'm 35 and I'm a mother of two beautiful children, Emma who's 11 and David who's 9. Let me start from the beginning. I grew up in what I thought was a normal middle-class family in suburban Ohio. My parents Robert and Linda owned a successful accounting firm and we lived comfortably. My sister Jessica is 3 years younger than me, and from the day she was born, it was clear she was the golden child. While I was expected to excel in school, help with chores, and earn my way through college, Jessica got everything handed to her on a silver platter. I worked 2 jobs through college, graduated with honors, and landed a good position as a marketing director at a mid-sized company. I met my husband Mike when I was 26, and we married 2 years later. Mike's a wonderful man. He's a high school teacher, and while we're not wealthy, we've built a good life together. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood, and our kids are happy and healthy. Jessica, on the other hand, dropped out of college after 2 years to find herself. She bounced from job to job, relationship to relationship, while my parents continued to support her financially. When she was 28, she married Brad, a guy who worked in sales and had a gambling problem that my parents chose to ignore. They bought Jessica and Brad a beautiful 4-bedroom house in an upscale neighborhood called Maple Ridge as a wedding gift, something they never even considered doing for Mike and me. That house cost them $425,000. But this story really begins last spring when Jessica announced she was pregnant with her first child. You'd think she discovered the cure for cancer based on how my parents reacted. They immediately started talking about how they needed to make sure Jessica had everything she needed for the baby. Meanwhile, I'd been struggling with some financial difficulties after Mike had to take unpaid leave when his father was dying of cancer and we'd fallen behind on our mortgage payments. When I mentioned to my parents that we were having trouble keeping up with our bills, my mother's response was, "Well, Sarah, you made your choices. You chose to have children young, and now you need to figure it out." The contrast in how they treated Jessica's pregnancy versus my existing children was stark and painful. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Saturday in June, and my parents had invited Mike and me over for dinner. Jessica and Brad were there too, and Jessica was showing off her growing belly to anyone who would listen. After dinner, my father cleared his throat and said he had some family business to discuss. "Your mother and I have been thinking," he began, "and we've decided that Jessica and Brad need a bigger house for the baby. We found a beautiful 6-bedroom home in Westfield Estates, and we've already put in an offer." I congratulated Jessica, though I felt a familiar sting of jealousy. Here they were buying her a second house, while Mike and I were struggling to keep our first one. But what came next was beyond anything I could have imagined. My father reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Now, Sarah, we need to talk to you about something important. We've already purchased this new house, and we need you to sign some documents related to the mortgage." I looked at the papers confused. Why would I need to sign anything for Jessica's house? "Well," my mother said slowly, "we had to put your name on the mortgage application for financial reasons. You have better credit than Jessica, and the bank required a co-signer. But don't worry, we'll handle all the payments." "The mortgage is $650,000, my father added. "We just need you to sign as the primary borrower, but like your mother said, we'll take care of everything." The room spun around me. "Wait, you want me to be legally responsible for a $650,000 mortgage? I can't afford that. We're already struggling with our own house payments." Jessica leaned back in her chair, one hand on her belly, with the most smug expression I'd ever seen. "Sarah, don't be so dramatic. Mom and Dad said they'll make the payments. You're just signing papers, but I'll be legally responsible if something goes wrong." I turned to my parents, hoping for some sign that this made sense. "What about my children? What about Emma and David? What happens to us if you can't make the payments?" My father's face hardened. "Nothing will go wrong, but Jessica comes first right now, and Emma and David can grow up and buy their own houses someday. Jessica is having our first grandchild, and she deserves the best. Emma and David are your grandchildren too," I shouted, but my mother waved her hand dismissively. "Some children are just more important than others, Sarah. Jessica's baby will be special. Our first real grandchild from our successful daughter." That's when Jessica delivered a line that still makes my blood boil. "Real mothers deserve real homes, Sarah. Maybe if you were a better mother, you'd understand that I need this more than you do." I looked at Mike, who was sitting in stunned silence, his face pale. Brad was smirking, clearly enjoying the show. My parents looked at me expectantly, as if I was supposed to just sign my life away. No, I said, standing up. Absolutely not. I will not sign those papers, and I will not put my family at financial risk for Jessica's mansion. This is insane. My father slammed his hand on the table. You ungrateful little! After everything we've done for you. What have you done for me? I screamed back. You paid for Jessica's college even after she dropped out. You bought her a house. You've given her everything while I worked my ass off for scraps. Get out, my mother hissed. Get out of our house and don't come back until you come to your senses. Mike and I left that night, and I thought that was the end of it. I was naive. Over the next few weeks, my parents called, constantly alternating between threats and guilt trips. They told me I was destroying the family, that I was selfish, that I was denying my sister's baby a proper home. Jessica would send me pictures of baby furniture and nursery decorations, always with captions like, "Too bad my sister doesn't care about her nephew's future." But I held firm. I refused to sign those papers or have anything to do with their scheme. I thought they'd eventually give up and find another way to pay for Jessica's house. I was wrong. 2 months later, I received a letter from a law firm. My parents were suing me for $650,000, claiming I had verbally agreed to take over the mortgage payments and was now breaching our contract. The letter stated that they had already purchased the house with me as the primary borrower, and I was legally responsible for the debt. I immediately called a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Hernandez, who specialized in family law. When I explained the situation, she was quiet for a long time before speaking. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did you sign anything at all? Even something that seemed unrelated? I racked my brain. No, I never signed the mortgage papers. I refused completely. What about other documents? Did they ever ask you to sign anything else in recent months? Think carefully. This could be important. Then it hit me. Oh my God. Last Christmas, my dad said he was updating some family financial documents and needed me to sign some papers. He said it was just routine paperwork to update beneficiaries and emergency contacts. I signed them without really reading them because I trusted him. Patricia's voice was grim. We need to get copies of everything you signed. Sarah, this sounds like fraud. If they tricked you into signing documents that made you responsible for this debt without your knowledge, that's a serious crime. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, document reviews, and sleepless nights. Patricia worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. And what she found was worse than I could have imagined. The papers I'd signed at Christmas weren't just routine family financial documents. Buried in the fine print were clauses that made me a co-signer on any future real estate purchases made by my parents for the benefit of the family. The documents also included power of attorney provisions that allowed them to sign financial documents on my behalf in certain circumstances. It was expertly crafted legal language that essentially gave them the right to put me on the hook for any property they bought as long as they claimed it was for family purposes. But Patricia found something else that made my blood run cold. The Christmas documents also included identity verification information that my parents had used to apply for the mortgage in my name. They had my social security number, copies of my identification, and even forged employment verification letters claiming I earned twice my actual salary. What's worse, I discovered that the first house they bought for Jessica, the $425,000 house in Maple Ridge, that I thought was a wedding gift, was also mortgaged in my name. I'd been legally responsible for Jessica's lifestyle for 3 years without knowing it, as my parents had been making the payments, but the debt was legally mine. The total amount they'd stuck me with was $1,075,000. The original $425,000 house, plus the new $650,000 house. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Brad, Jessica's husband, had been having an affair, and his mistress had been blackmailing him. In his desperation, he'd confided in her about the family's financial scheme, and she'd recorded their conversations. When she realized Brad wasn't going to leave Jessica, she turned vindictive and sent the recordings to Patricia. In the recordings, Brad clearly described how my parents had planned to stick Sarah with the bills and how Jessica had been laughing about her stupid sister paying for everything. There were also references to other family members being brought in on the scheme, including my Uncle Tom, who worked in real estate and had helped structure the fraudulent documents. Additionally, Patricia discovered emails between my parents and their lawyer discussing how to make Sarah responsible for Jessica's house and ensure the golden child gets what she deserves. There were also communications with a real estate agent about finding a house expensive enough to teach Sarah a lesson about family loyalty. When Patricia subpoenaed my parents' financial records, she found that they had been siphoning money from their business accounts to pay for Jessica's lifestyle, and they were in serious financial trouble. They couldn't afford the $650,000 house, so they devised this scheme to force me to pay for it while making it look like I'd agreed to it. Armed with this evidence, Patricia filed countersuits against my parents for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. She also reported them to the State Board of Accountancy since they'd used their position as accountants to create fraudulent documents. The case went to trial 14 months later. I'll never forget walking into that courtroom and seeing my parents and Jessica sitting at the defendant's table. Jessica had given birth 4 months earlier, and she brought the baby to court several times, clearly hoping to gain sympathy from the jury. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Patricia methodically presented our evidence, showing the jury how my parents had systematically planned to defraud me. The recorded conversations were particularly damning, especially the parts where Jessica could be heard laughing about how stupid I was for trusting them. What made the trial even more devastating for my parents was the parade of witnesses Patricia called to testify. She had tracked down several of my parents' former clients who had noticed irregularities in their accounting practices. One woman, Mrs. Henderson, testified that my father had tried to convince her to put her daughter's name on a property deed for estate planning purposes in a way that sounded remarkably similar to what he'd done to me. Another damaging witness was my childhood neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had known our family for over 20 years. She testified about the stark differences in how my parents treated Jessica and me growing up. She described watching my parents buy Jessica a brand new car for her 16th birthday, while I was expected to work at the local grocery store to save money for a used one. She talked about birthday parties where Jessica received expensive gifts while I got practical items like school supplies. It was always clear that Jessica was the favorite, Mrs. Thompson said on the stand. But what struck me was how Sarah never complained. She just worked harder, as if she thought she had to earn the love that Jessica got for free. The most shocking testimony came from Brad's former gambling buddies. Patricia had subpoenaed them after discovering that Brad had bragged about the scheme during poker games. One man, Tony Ritchie, testified that Brad had called me the family ATM and had joked about how my parents were finally making the responsible daughter pay for the fun one's lifestyle. Brad said they'd been planning this for months, Tony testified. He said Jessica's parents were worried about their business going under, so they figured they'd stick Sarah with the bills and kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Get Jessica a nice house, and get themselves out of financial trouble. This testimony revealed another layer to the scheme that even I hadn't fully understood. My parents weren't just favoring Jessica. They were using both of us to solve their own financial problems. Jessica got the lifestyle she wanted, and I got stuck with the bills while my parents protected their own assets. The financial forensics expert that Patricia hired painted an even grimmer picture. Dr. Elizabeth Kowalski, a certified fraud examiner, had analyzed my parents' business records going back 5 years. She testified that my parents had been systematically moving money out of their business accounts to fund Jessica's lifestyle, creating a deficit that they were trying to cover by forcing me to take on debt. What we see here is a classic case of financial fraud disguised as family dynamics, Dr. Kowalski testified. The defendants created a situation where they could maintain their lifestyle and fund their preferred daughter's expenses while transferring the financial burden to the victim without her knowledge or consent. She also revealed that the Christmas documents I'd signed were just the latest in a series of manipulative legal maneuvers. My parents had been forging my signature on smaller financial documents for years, gradually building a paper trail that would support their eventual large-scale fraud. They had opened credit cards in my name, taken out small loans using my information, and even filed false tax documents claiming me as a dependent long after I became financially independent. The emotional impact of these revelations was devastating. Sitting in that courtroom, I realized that my entire adult relationship with my parents had been built on lies and manipulation. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every seemingly innocent conversation had been part of their long-term plan to exploit me financially. My parents' lawyer tried to argue that I was a willing participant in the scheme, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Christmas documents were clearly designed to deceive me, and the fact that my parents had been paying the mortgages while keeping me unaware of the debt showed clear intent to defraud. The most powerful moment came when Patricia played a recording of my mother talking to Jessica about the plan. In her own voice, my mother said, "Sarah's always been the responsible one, so she'll figure out how to pay for it. And if she doesn't, we'll just take her house too. Either way, Jessica gets what she deserves." When Jessica took the stand, Patricia tore her apart. Under cross-examination, Jessica admitted that she'd known about the scheme from the beginning and had actively participated in deceiving me. She broke down crying, claiming she'd only gone along with it because she was pregnant and scared, but the damage was done. The trial ended with a verdict that exceeded my wildest dreams. The jury found my parents and Jessica guilty of fraud and conspiracy. I was awarded $1,800,000 in damages, the full amount of the fraudulent debt $1,075,000, plus $725,000 in punitive damages for emotional distress, identity theft, and the cost of the legal battle. But the financial judgment was just the beginning of their downfall. Within a week of the verdict, the State Board of Accountancy revoked my parents' licenses to practice accounting. Their business, which had been struggling anyway, collapsed completely. They were forced to declare bankruptcy and lost their own home. Jessica and Brad's marriage didn't survive the scandal. The affair recordings became public during the trial, and Jessica filed for divorce while she was still in the hospital recovering from childbirth. She was forced to sell both houses and move into a small apartment. The stress of the legal battle and divorce caused her to have severe postpartum depression, and she spent several weeks in a mental health facility getting treatment. My Uncle Tom, who had helped structure the fraudulent documents, was also sued and lost his real estate license. Several other family members who had been aware of the scheme but said nothing were named in the civil suits. But perhaps the most satisfying part of the whole ordeal was watching my parents' reputation in the community crumble. The local newspaper covered the trial extensively, and the story of their fraud spread throughout our small town. They went from being respected business owners to being known as the people who tried to steal from their own daughter. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Martinez, had some particularly harsh words for my parents during sentencing. She said, "In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a calculated and cruel betrayal of family trust. You didn't just steal money from your daughter. You stole her sense of security, her faith in family, and her children's future. The fact that you did this while claiming to act in the best interests of family makes your actions even more reprehensible." She also had words for Jessica. "You may be young, but you are not a child. You actively participated in a scheme to defraud your sister, and you showed no remorse until you were caught. Your pregnancy does not excuse your actions, and I hope you will think long and hard about the kind of mother you want to be." The financial restitution allowed Mike and me to pay off our mortgage completely and set up college funds for Emma and David. We also moved to a bigger house in a better school district in a completely different area of town from where Jessica had lived. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the restoration of my sense of justice and the vindication of my decision to stand up to my family's abuse. For years, I had questioned whether I was being too sensitive about my parents' favoritism toward Jessica. The trial proved that my instincts had been right all along. The aftermath of the trial was difficult for everyone involved. My parents attempted to reconcile with me several times, but their apologies always came with conditions and excuses. My mother would say things like, "We're sorry you were hurt, but we were just trying to help Jessica," as if they still didn't understand what they had done wrong. Jessica made one attempt to reconcile showing up at my house with her baby when he was about 6 months old. She stood on my doorstep holding her son and said, "Sarah, I know things got out of hand, but we're family. Don't you want to meet your nephew?" I looked at this beautiful baby who had no idea what his mother and grandparents had done, and I felt a moment of sadness for him. But I also knew that Jessica was trying to manipulate me using her child, just as my parents had manipulated me using the idea of family loyalty. "Jessica," I said, "I hope you raise that child to be a better person than you are, but I can't have you in my life. You chose to destroy our relationship when you chose to steal from me." She left in tears, but I felt no satisfaction in her pain. I only felt relief that the chapter was finally closed. The legal battle took 2.5 years to fully resolve, but the financial and personal costs to my parents and Jessica were immediate and devastating. My parents lost their business, their home, their reputation, and their standing in the community. They were forced to move to a different state to escape the shame and start over. Jessica struggled as a single mother without the financial support she'd become accustomed to. She had to get a job for the first time in years working at a retail store to pay for her small apartment. Brad, despite his gambling problem and infidelity, had been providing some financial stability, and without him, Jessica faced the reality of supporting herself and her child on her own. The extended family members who had been aware of the scheme also faced consequences. Uncle Tom's real estate career was effectively over, and several family members who had remained silent during the fraud were ostracized by the community once the truth came out. The ripple effects of the trial extended far beyond just my immediate family. My cousin Rachel Uncle Tom's daughter reached out to me after the verdict to apologize for her father's involvement. She told me that she had suspected something was wrong when she overheard phone conversations between him and my parents, but she hadn't known how to approach me about it. I kept thinking I should say something Rachel told me over coffee a few weeks after the trial ended, but Dad made it sound like you had agreed to help with Jessica's house, like this was some kind of family financial arrangement that I just didn't understand. I feel terrible that I didn't speak up. Rachel wasn't the only family member who came forward after the trial. My father's other brother, Uncle Mark, who lived in California, called me to express his shock and disgust at what had happened. He told me that my father had always been manipulative with money, but he'd never imagined it would escalate to outright fraud. Your father used to brag about his business deals and how he could structure things to his advantage, Uncle Mark told me. He said it was just smart financial planning, but looking back, I can see it was really about control. I'm sorry I didn't see what he was doing to you. These conversations were both healing and heartbreaking. It was validating to learn that other people had noticed my parents' problematic behavior over the years, but it was also painful to realize how many people had suspected something was wrong but hadn't intervened. The most surprising revelation came from my paternal grandmother's old housekeeper, Maria Santos, who had worked for my grandmother until her death 3 years earlier. Maria contacted Patricia after reading about the trial in the newspaper. She had information that shed new light on my family's financial history. Your grandmother knew, Maria told me when we met at her small apartment. She knew your parents were favoring Jessica and she didn't like it. Before she died, she changed her will to leave equal amounts to you and Jessica. But your parents were supposed to be the executors. This was news to me. I had never received anything from my grandmother's estate, and my parents had told me that she had left everything to Jessica because Jessica needs it more. Maria showed me documents that proved my grandmother had indeed intended for me to inherit half of her estate, about $85,000, that would have helped Mike and me significantly during our financial struggles. Your parents never told you, Maria asked, seeing the shock on my face. Abuela specifically said she wanted to make sure you were taken care of because she knew your parents treated you differently. This revelation led to yet another legal battle as Patricia helped me file a claim against my parents for stealing my inheritance. The probate court ruled in my favor, and my parents were forced to pay me the $85,000 plus interest and penalties. This additional judgment came just as they were trying to recover from the bankruptcy caused by the original fraud case. But perhaps the most poetic justice came a year after the trial. Jessica, desperate for money and still unable to accept responsibility for her actions, attempted to sell her story to a tabloid magazine. She painted herself as a victim of family drama and claimed that I had stolen her inheritance and left her and her baby destitute. The magazine fact-checked her story and discovered the truth about the fraud case. Instead of the sympathetic story Jessica had hoped for, they published an article titled, "The Sister Who Stole Everything," but Jessica was cast as the thief, not me. The article included excerpts from the trial transcripts and the recorded conversations showing Jessica's true character to a national audience. That article was picked up by several online news sites, and Jessica's name became permanently associated with the fraud scandal. Any future employer or potential romantic partner could easily find the story with a simple Google search. Meanwhile, my life has flourished in ways I never expected. The financial security from the court judgment allowed me to start my own marketing consulting business, which has grown beyond my wildest dreams. Mike was able to take a sabbatical from teaching to help me launch the business, and we've become true partners in every sense of the word. Emma and David have thrived in their new school district. Emma is now 14 and excels in mathematics, while David, now 12, has discovered a love for art. They both know the general outline of what happened with their grandparents and aunt, but I've tried to shield them from the worst details. They understand that sometimes adults make bad choices and that it's important to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. The most unexpected outcome of this whole ordeal has been the relationships I built with other family members who were not involved in the scheme. My father's sister, Aunt Carol, reached out to me after the trial to apologize for not speaking up when she suspected something wasn't right. She's become a wonderful grandmother figure for Emma and David, and she's helped fill some of the void left by my parents' betrayal. I've also connected with several other women who've experienced similar family financial abuse. There's apparently a whole community of people whose family members have tried to manipulate them into taking on debt or giving up assets for the good of a family. We formed a support group that meets monthly, and I've been able to help several other women navigate similar legal challenges. The emotional healing has been slower than the financial and legal resolution. For a long time, I struggled with guilt and anger. I felt guilty for taking such a hard stance against my family, especially when I saw how their lives fell apart. I felt angry at myself for trusting them in the first place and for not seeing the warning signs earlier. Therapy helped me understand that what my parents and Jessica did wasn't just about money. It was about power and control. They had trained me from childhood to put Jessica's needs ahead of my own. And when I finally refused to do so, they escalated to fraud and manipulation. The fact that they were willing to destroy my life for their own convenience showed that they had never really seen me as a person worthy of respect and consideration. It took me a long time to accept that some relationships can't be repaired, even family relationships. I grew up believing that blood was thicker than water and that you should always forgive family members no matter what they did. But I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean allowing people to continue hurting you, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to protect yourself and your children from toxic people. 3 years after the final legal resolution, I received a letter from my mother. She was working as a bookkeeper at a small company in another state, and she and my father were living in a modest apartment. They were both in their late 60s now, and starting over at their age had been incredibly difficult. The letter was full of apologies and explanations, but what struck me most was the final paragraph. "I know you may never forgive us, Sarah, but I need you to know that losing you and Emma and David has been the hardest consequence of our actions. We thought we were helping Jessica, but we destroyed our family instead. Your father and I are old now, and we realize we may never meet our grandchildren or see you again. I hope someday you'll find it in your heart to give us another chance." I read that letter several times, and I felt a familiar tug of guilt and sadness. Part of me wanted to respond to open the door to reconciliation, but then I thought about Emma and David and about the example I wanted to set for them. I thought about how my parents had been willing to sacrifice my children's security for Jessica's comfort, and how they had shown no real remorse until they faced serious consequences. I didn't respond to the letter. Instead, I filed it away with all the other legal documents from the case. Not out of spite, but out of a recognition that some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. Jessica has made a few attempts to contact me over the years, usually around holidays or her son's birthday. She's never fully apologized or taken responsibility for her actions. Her messages are always some variation of, "I know we had our differences, but family is family," or "Don't you think it's time to move past this for the sake of the children?" She seems to genuinely believe that what happened was just a family disagreement rather than criminal fraud. But I've learned that family is often used as an excuse to enable bad behavior. Real family members don't steal from each other, lie to each other, or try to destroy each other's lives. Real family members protect and support each other even when it's inconvenient. The house that started this whole mess, the $650,000 mansion in Westfield Estates, was eventually sold at a significant loss during the legal proceedings. The new owners have no idea of the drama that surrounded its purchase, and I imagine they're very happy there. Sometimes I drive past it when I'm in that area, and I think about how different my life might have been if I had just signed those papers and accepted my parents' scheme. I probably would have lost my own house within a year. Mike and I would have faced financial ruin, and our children would have suffered. I would have enabled Jessica's entitlement and my parents' favoritism, and they would have continued to take advantage of me for the rest of their lives. Standing up to them was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the most important. Today, Emma is 14 and David is 12. They're both doing well in school and have friends and activities they enjoy. They have a loving, extended family that includes Mike's parents, Aunt Carol, and several close family friends who have become like relatives to us. They know they're loved and valued not just as extensions of someone else's dreams or tools for someone else's benefit. Mike and I celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary last month. The stress of the legal battle actually brought us closer together, and he's been my rock throughout this entire ordeal. He never once suggested that I should just give in to my parents' demands, even when it would have been easier for our family. He understood that this was about more than money. It was about respect, dignity, and the kind of family we wanted to build for our children. My business continues to grow, and I've been able to hire several employees. I've made it a point to create a workplace culture based on fairness and respect, something I learned to value deeply after experiencing the opposite from my own family. Several of my employees have told me that they've never worked in such a supportive environment, and I take pride in that. I still sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had handled things differently. What if I had tried to work out a compromise with my parents? What if I had offered to help Jessica in some other way? But then I remember Jessica's smirk when she said, Real mothers deserve real homes, and my mother's cold declaration that some children are just more important than others. And I know I made the right choice. The truth is, my parents and Jessica didn't see me as a person with my own needs, dreams, and responsibilities. They saw me as a resource to be used for Jessica's benefit. When I refused to play that role, they were willing to commit fraud to force me into it. That's not the behavior of people who love and respect you. That's the behavior of people who see you as a means to an end. The $1,800,000 judgment was satisfying, but the real victory was breaking free from a toxic family dynamic that had been controlling my life since childhood. I learned that I didn't have to set myself on fire to keep other people warm, and that my children deserved a mother who stood up for herself and for them. If I could go back and give advice to my younger self, I would tell her to trust her instincts earlier. I would tell her that feeling like an outsider in your own family isn't normal, and that parents who truly love their children don't play favorites to such a destructive degree. I would tell her that she deserved better than to be treated as a secondary character in her own life. But I can't go back, and I wouldn't want to. The path I took was difficult and painful, but it led me to a place of strength and authenticity that I never could have reached otherwise. My children are growing up knowing that they matter, that their needs are important, and that they don't have to sacrifice themselves for other people's comfort. Sometimes people ask me if I regret taking such a hard stance against my family. They ask if I miss my parents and sister, especially during holidays or special occasions. The answer is complicated. I miss the idea of having loving, supportive parents in a close relationship with my sister. But I don't miss the reality of what those relationships actually were: one-sided, manipulative, and ultimately destructive. I've learned that it's possible to grieve the loss of family relationships while also celebrating your freedom from toxic dynamics. I've learned that protecting your children sometimes means making difficult choices that other people don't understand. And I've learned that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. The house that my parents tried to force me to buy has become a symbol of everything I've overcome. It represents their attempt to control and manipulate me, but it also represents my refusal to be controlled. When I drive past it now, I don't feel anger or sadness. I feel proud of the woman who was strong enough to say no, even when it cost her everything she thought she knew about family. Emma and David will grow up with a different understanding of family than I did. They'll know that family relationships should be based on mutual respect and love, not on obligation and manipulation. They'll know that it's okay to set boundaries even with people you love. And they'll know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to refuse to enable someone else's bad behavior. My parents and Jessica may never understand why I made the choices I did. They may continue to see themselves as the victims of my selfishness and stubbornness, but I've made peace with their inability to see the truth. I can't control their perspective, but I can control my own choices and my own life. The last I heard, Jessica was still struggling as a single mother, working retail jobs and living paycheck to paycheck. My parents were still in their small apartment in another state trying to rebuild their lives in their late 60s. Part of me feels sorry for them, but I also know that they're experiencing the natural consequences of their own choices. They chose to commit fraud, they chose to prioritize one child over another, they chose to try to destroy my life for their own convenience. And when those choices led to consequences they didn't like, they blamed me for not being willing to be their victim. I chose to stand up for myself and my children. I chose to fight for what was right, even when it was hard. I chose to break a cycle of favoritism and manipulation that could have continued for generations. And I chose to build a life based on honesty, respect, and genuine love. Looking back, I can see that this whole ordeal was never really about the house. It was about power control and the courage to break free from a system that was designed to keep me in a subservient role. The house was just the catalyst that forced me to confront the truth about my family and make a choice about what kind of life I wanted to live. I chose freedom. I chose self-respect. I chose my children's future over my family's comfort. And I chose to believe that I deserved better than to be treated as a secondary character in my own life. 3 years later, I can say with confidence that I made the right choice. My children are thriving, my marriage is strong, my business is successful, and I wake up every day knowing that I stood up for what was right. That's worth more than any house, any amount of money, or any family approval. The judge was right when she said that my parents had stolen more than just money from me. They had stolen my sense of security and faith in family. But what they didn't realize is that by forcing me to fight for myself, they also gave me something invaluable: the knowledge that I was strong enough to stand alone if I had to. I don't stand alone anymore. I have a family built on love and respect, friends who value me for who I am, and a business that reflects my values. I have a life that I'm proud of and children who know they're loved unconditionally. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. My parents and Jessica tried to destroy my life, but instead they freed me to build something better than I ever could have imagined. The house they tried to force me to buy was supposed to be my prison, but it became the key to my freedom. And that's a victory worth more than any judgment a court could award.